It's February 3rd, 2024. This is Political Dharma, and I'm Alan Zundell. Today is the day of the South Carolina Democratic primary, followed 3 days later by the North Carolina and Nevada Democratic primaries. That same date, the latter one, Tuesday, February 6th, is also the date of the Republican Nevada primary, followed 2 days later by the Republican Nevada caucuses. Why is the Republican Party of Nevada holding caucuses 2 days after their primary? I'll explain that more later in the show, but the answer has to do with how the mega crowd, that is the Trump supporters, are trying to rig the process in favor of Trump. But first, I'm going to look at updates on Reverend F. Kennedy Jr. and Cornel West, who are independent candidates for the presidency, as well as take a look at two recent voter opinion polls that are measuring support for the various candidates for president. First, let's go to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In last week's episode, I said that he was considering running as the Libertarian Party's candidate for president. Libertarian Party is the largest minor party in the United States, but that was breaking news the morning of the show, and I didn't have a clip available, so this week I do. This is Kennedy being interviewed on the Michael Schmerkanis show on CNN.
Is it possible that you will seek, as you are running as an independent, you will seek still to be the Libertarian candidate, which would assure you getting on all 50 state ballots?
That's something that we're looking at. We have a really good relationship with the Libertarian Party. I'm going to be speaking at the California Libertarian Party convention. I think it's next week or maybe a couple of weeks. And then we're talking about me speaking in New York. But, so that is, and then we have our own political party now in 6 states, which have rules that make that give us an advantage to have our own political party. We're not going to have a problem getting on the ballot.
I ask you the question because Angela McArdle, the head of the Libertarian Party, Catherine, do we have the sound of this, by the way? Tell me quickly. Okay, I want to play something for the audience. This is the head of the Libertarian Party on my radio show in the fall. Roll it.
We've had a lot of good conversations and we're on good terms. And I respect his decision to want to go independent. The Libertarians really admire the strong position he took against mandates and lockdowns. And so we're going to stay on friendly terms and see what happens.
Bobby, make some news. I mean, it sounded to me like she's welcoming you to come in and ask for their ballot position.
Yeah, well, we are talking to the Libertarian Party, and I feel very comfortable with most of the values of the Libertarian Party. And, we, like I say, we have good relationships. I'm talking regularly to Libertarian groups. So we'll continue to do those talks. I can't give you a headline news story today, Michael. I'm sorry. Ask about something different.
I also reported that Kennedy was speaking at the California Libertarian Party State Convention later this month, and a little later in the week, they added Cornel West to the list of speakers scheduled for that convention. I doubt West is seeking their nomination, as his progressive policy views are far from the free market views of libertarians, but he may be seeking their votes based on their mutual agreement on stopping U.S. interventionism abroad and challenging the corporate corruption of our political system. That is likely true of Kennedy's presence in the convention as well, despite Kennedy's backing U.S. support for Israel. Speaking of Dr. West, last week I said that he was forming a new political party in states where it's easier to form a new political party than it is to get your name on the ballot as an independent candidate. So this week he revealed the name of his new party.
We are proud to already be on the ballot in the state of Alaska, Oregon. We're on the move and we have a 50-state strategy. That's why the establishment of the Justice for All Party. That's right, we're calling for the Justice for All Party to be used to gain access to the ballot in those states where it's easier to gain access to the ballot party as opposed to independent. I'll be an independent in other states. But I'm calling for you as volunteer, you as citizen, you to become part of this campaign, which ain't nothing but a moment in a movement based on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Dorothy Day, Rabbi Heschel, Edward Zayed, Cesar Chavez. It goes on and on. The best of the history of America, the best of the president of America, concerned about poor and working people, justice for all party. We're on our way to 50 states. Come with us. Be a part of us.
Next on our agenda are a couple of new voter opinion polls on the presidential race. On January 22nd, the well-regarded Harvard-Harris poll was released, giving voters views of presidential candidates as of January 17th and 18th. The new poll showed little change from their previous poll conducted on December 13th and 14th. When asked who voters would choose to vote from among the five candidacies of Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cornel West, and Jill Stein, who's the likely nominee of the Green Party, the changes in the results were insignificant. As you see in the pie charts at the top, if you're watching the video version of this podcast, the numbers for each candidate are at most 2 percentage points different from December to January. Given the margin of error, there is virtually no change. For those who don't know, the margin of error is a statistical term for the possible difference between the actual views of the voters of interest and the smaller set of voters who were selected to be polled. It's generally about plus or minus 2.5 percentage points. The January results were Trump at 44%, Biden at 33%, RFK at 18%, West at 3%, and Stein at 2%. The graphs on the bottom break the results down by whether the voter identifies as a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. Again, there's little change from December to January. The largest change that I spotted was a 5 percentage point drop in support for Biden among independents and a 4 percentage point gain in support for RFK among Republicans. Again, these are very small changes. This week, the also well-regarded Quinnipiac poll was released, again showing little change from their previous poll in December. There is no change in the total support for each of the five candidates larger than a few percentage points. The January results were Biden at 39%, Trump at 37%, Kennedy at 14%, West at 3%, and Stein at 2%. These results are not too far from what the Harvard-Harris poll showed, although the Quinnipiac poll showed Biden 6 percentage points higher, Trump 7 percentage points lower, and Kennedy 4 points lower. Comparing the two polls, we can infer that Biden has roughly between 33 to 39% support, with Trump in the lead at between 37 and 44% support, and Kennedy at between 14 and 18% support. West and Stein are at 3 and 2% respectively in both polls. But why, you might ask, are the polls different at all? There are a couple of reasons that could explain why the polls are different. First of all, you have to consider the margin of error, which could easily add a couple of percentage points of difference between the two polls. But second, the two polls were conducted about a week apart, with the Harvard-Harris done on January 17th and 18th, and the Quinnipiac poll conducted on January 25th through 29th. Now, most voters aren't going to change their minds in a week. Consider staunch Trump supporters or Democratic loyalists. They're pretty much got their candidates and are going to stick with them. But there is a set of voters who haven't made their minds up yet, or maybe haven't even paid much attention to the presidential race and who the various candidates are. Some small percentage of those voters could easily change their minds in a week based on, say, a breaking news event or a conversation with some trusted friend, or even just giving further thought to the presidential race. So now let's look at the Quinnipiac results broken down by different subgroups of voters. The biggest changes from December to January were in Biden's support among independents, which was up 6 percentage points, women up 4 percentage points, and whites with a 4-year college degree up 5 points. Such small changes in subgroup support do not add up to any significant change in total voter support. Remember that many of these subgroups overlap with each other. The biggest change in Trump's support was among men, up 4 points. The biggest change for RFK were among Republicans, up 4 points, and men, down 4 points. There were no changes in support for West or Stein larger than 3 percentage points. You might have noticed that the two polls contradict themselves about Biden's support among independents, with Harvard-Harris showing a small drop in support and the Quinnipiac Poll showing a small gain in support. Independent voters would be the most likely to be able to change their mind in a week's time, so maybe that's what's happening. But also both polls agreed that Kennedy has a small gain in support from Republicans, so maybe that's a trustworthy finding. Quinnipiac also shows a breakdown by other subgroups, which indicates some bigger changes going on. One of the big changes was in the 18 to 34-year-old category, where support jumped 13 percentage points for Trump, while dropping 8 points for Kennedy and 5 points for Stein. I don't have an explanation for this other than perhaps Kennedy's support among younger voters dropped due to support for Israel's action in Gaza, but that wouldn't explain a gain for Trump and a loss for Stein. Among 35 to 49-year-olds, there was a gain for Biden of 6 points and a loss for Kennedy of 4 points, which is a smaller change and, again, hard to interpret. Among those 65 and older, there's a gain for Biden of 6 points and a loss for Trump by the same amount. Among women, Biden is up 4 points and Trump is down by 6. Another big change showed up with Black voters, with Biden down 5 points and Trump up by 9. Stein was also down by 7 points. Among Hispanics, Trump was up by an even bigger 12 percentage points, with Biden down 4 and Kennedy down 8. Summing up the Quinnipiac findings, there's some movement in voter support among the various subgroups of the voting population, but there's not enough to change the total support for each candidate. The biggest changes were among younger voters, Blacks and Hispanics, with Trump benefiting the most and Kennedy being hurt. Now let's look at each poll's findings about net favorability toward the candidates. In Harvard-Harris, Kennedy still tops the net favorability rating at 18, exactly the same number as in December. Net favorability is found by taking the percent of voters who view a candidate favorably and subtracting the percent of voters who view that candidate unfavorably. The favorability ratings for Donald Trump, Cornel West, and Jill Stein have changed no more than a few percentage points, which, given the margin of error, means they're virtually the same. Trump's favorability is 0, West's is -2, and Stein's is -8. A lot of voters don't have an opinion yet of West or Stein, and that's true of RFK as well, although more people have heard of him than have heard of West or Stein, of course. At a January rating of -14, Biden does show a decline of 4 percentage points in net favorability, which is the largest of these 5 candidates, but still very small. The Quinnipiac poll, however, does show changes from December to January, with Biden gaining 5 points for a January rating of -15, Trump losing 9 points for a January rating of -22, and Kennedy losing 7 points for a January rating of -9. West and Stein weren't included in their favorability ratings. Why these changes happened in the Quinnipiac poll and why similar changes aren't found in the Harvard-Harris poll are mysteries to me. An even bigger mystery is why the ratings are so different between the two polls. Biden's are virtually the same, but Trump is 22 points less and Kennedy 27 points less in the Quinnipiac poll than in the Harvard-Harris poll. These are really big differences, much bigger than you'd expect just from the passing of a week's time. The difference between the polls in December are not as large, with Biden 5 points less in Quinnipiac than Harvard-Harris, Trump 12 points less, and RFK 16 points less, but both Quinnipiac polls, December and January, showed negative ratings for all 3 candidates, with the negative ratings growing for Trump and Kennedy between December and January. I don't have any idea what this is, but the Quinnipiac results and favorability seemed extreme to me, so I went to another source. The 538 website by ABC News combines the results of multiple public opinion polls and uses a complex formula to adjust their findings in a way that's supposed to make them more accurate. Their results on Biden's net favorability are just 1 or 2 points higher than the Harvard-Harris and Quinnipiac polls, hovering at about minus 16 or 17 points throughout January. So there's some consistency there. The results on Trump show him hovering at about minus 9 points throughout January, which is close to halfway between Harvard-Harris's 0 and Quinnipiac's minus 22. So for some reason, Harvard-Harris and Quinnipiac seem to be outlier polls at opposite ends from the average. 538 hasn't been tracking RFK's net favorability rating, so I couldn't compare their results to the Harvard-Harris poll or the Quinnipiac poll. But if it's between their wide extremes of plus 18 and minus 9 points, his net favorability is actually somewhere around plus 4 or 5 points. Higher than Biden or Trump, but not as high as some of the polls indicate. So who knows? Take them with a grain of salt. Harvard-Harris shows 20% of voters haven't heard of or have no opinion of Kennedy, and the Quinnipiac poll shows a whopping 42% of the voters say they haven't heard enough about Kennedy to have an opinion of him. So over time, there should be some convergence on the views of Kennedy in these polls as we move toward the general election and people make up their minds about Kennedy and learn more about him. So, okay, so much for that. Let's turn now to the major party primaries and caucuses. Today's the day of the Democrat South Carolina primary, where Joe Biden is expected to win big. It's the first of the Democratic caucuses and primaries to actually award delegates to their national convention this summer. As I've been saying across a few episodes, the Democratic establishment has been rigging the primary process to favor the nomination of Joe Biden. For a quick review of some of the ways they've been trying to do this, they did everything they could to try to make South Carolina the first Democratic presidential contest in the news because Biden did so well in that state in 2020. In the Iowa caucuses, which generally come before South Carolina and did this year as well, this year they simply didn't have the presidential preference vote in the caucuses. Rather, they had mail-in ballots for the presidential vote, and they won't release the results until March after the South Carolina primary. In New Hampshire, which is traditionally the first in the nation primary, the Democratic National Committee pressured the New Hampshire Democrats not to hold the primary. But the New Hampshire Democrats refused because, according to state law, they have to be the first in the nation. And so Biden didn't put his name on the ballot. They held a primary election, but there's not any delegates awarded on the basis of that vote because the state held their primary without the sanction of the Democratic National Committee. Second, Biden's refused to debate with his competitors like Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson in order to keep them out of the public eye by having a nationally televised debate. And then several states have submitted only one name to their elections officials as the name to be on the Democratic primary ballot, and that name is Joe Biden. Florida, for example, not only submitted only Biden's name, but because there's only going to be one name on the Democratic primary, they're not going to hold a Democratic primary. They're simply going to award all their delegates to Biden to go to the national convention this summer. So some of the ways the Democrats are rigging the process. Now I got to give equal time to the Republicans and their shenanigans. They kept the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary first, but now that it's coming to the Nevada primary, they've decided it's time to try to take things in a different direction and give Trump some advantages. In a January 30th article in Politico, David Siders explained how state party officials rigged the delegate selection process. In 2021, the Nevada legislature passed a law requiring the state to hold primaries, which will be held this coming Tuesday. But diehard Trump supporters didn't like the idea of opening voting to just any Republicans, so they decided to ignore the primary and hold caucuses 3 days later. The idea is that hardcore Trump supporters will find it easier to dominate the in-person caucuses than they would to dominate a primary open to all Republican voters across the state. So the delegates are going to be awarded according to the caucus vote and not according to the primary vote. An article appearing in Politico today gives more details. Given the Republican opposition to the primary, and like Biden in New Hampshire, Trump hadn't bothered to put his name on the Nevada ballot by the October 15th deadline. But Nikki Haley did, hoping at the time that doing better than expected in Iowa and New Hampshire would spill over to Nevada and give her campaign a boost. So the Trump Republicans also passed a rule saying that any candidate who participated in the primary couldn't participate in the caucuses. So when you see Nikki Haley win the Nevada primary on Tuesday, remember, it doesn't mean anything. The delegates are going to be awarded to the winner of the caucuses, and Haley's been excluded from the caucuses. And just like Biden, Trump has refused to debate his competitors for the nomination. That hasn't prevented the debates from being televised, but without Trump, viewership was much lower than it would have been, thus denying his competitors a chance to reach a bigger audience. What about the idea of making sure that his name is the only name on the ballot? Well, the Republicans haven't followed that playbook, but they did come up with some moves that are going to have a similar effect. For example, in California, the Republican Party determined that if any candidate gets more than half the primary votes, that candidate will get all of the state's delegates to the national convention. Of course, with California being the most populous state, that's a lot of delegates. So if Trump gets 50% of the vote or more, he gets all the delegates, no matter how well Haley does. Texas has a similar rule in that a candidate getting a majority in the primary vote gets a disproportionate share of the delegates. Even worse, Florida, Ohio, and Illinois are going to award all their states' delegates to the candidate who gets the most votes in their primary, even if it's not a majority of the votes. So there's other things I could mention, but that's enough. I just want to let you know that Democrats don't have a monopoly on trying to rig their primary process to favor a particular candidate. Okay, that's it for this week. If you got anything on the show, like it, subscribe to the channel. If you use Rumble, this video is also over on Rumble. And also, if you like to listen to audio versions of podcasts, I'm on Spotify, Apple, and a few other podcast streaming platforms. So you can look for Political Dharma there as well. If you can donate anything to help support the show, you'll find a PayPal link at the bottom of the program description right below the video. And I guess that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you again here. Bye for now.
With ease, I see the chains are breaking. We gained our focus, the moves we're making will prove to determine our self-worth as a passenger on this vehicle Earth.